The brain consists of three major parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Now let's go a little deeper into those. All right, real quick review. Here we have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The brainstem consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The midbrain is also known as the mesencephalon. Superior to that, you have what is called the diencephalon. Some could argue that it's part of the brainstem, but for this discussion, we're going to talk about it pertaining to the hypothalamus and the thalamus. So I'm going to bring this one in right here and go a little tighter. The thalamus is there, and then there's your hypothalamus. Here's the frontal lobe. Here's the back. So just posterior sits the hypothalamus. There is your pituitary gland, and that comes into play here in a second. So the thalamus is for sensory relay, relaying signals originating from the body to the cerebral cortex, and is also involved in memory and emotional functions. The hypothalamus, however, is the major control center for the autonomic nervous system and plays an essential role in homeostatic regulation. The thalamus joins the endocrine system with the nervous system by way of the pituitary gland, and additionally there is involvement with temperature regulations, memory, the sleep-wake cycle, and emotional behavior. The brainstem consists of the three major parts that we talked about before. You have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The midbrain, or the mesencephalon, is a very complex structure, but for the sake of this conversation, it controls movement and coordination. The pons is the origin of 4 of the 12 cranial nerves, and then the medulla oblongata is where the brain meets the spinal cord. The medulla is essential for survival by controlling heart rhythm, breathing, blood flow, as well as reflexes like coughing, sneezing, and vomiting. In addition to the longitudinal fissure, you have other lines and folds throughout the brain. The folds are called gyri, while the grooves are called sulci or the sulcus. The main one off the bat, you have the central sulcus. The central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus separates the parietal and the frontal from the temporal lobe. And then here in the back, you have the occipital lobe. So, to better understand why certain things are called what they're called, you have sutures on the skull, right? So we take this off. You have the frontal, right? That's your frontal lobe. You have the parietal, that is your parietal lobe. You have the occipital, that is your occipital lobe. And then you have the temporal, which is there, and that is your temporal lobe. So here we have the central sulcus. Anterior to the central sulcus in green, you have the frontal lobe. And this is involved in voluntary motor control, as mentioned before, as well as emotion, motivation, planning, and judgment. Here in the yellow, posterior to the central sulcus, is the parietal lobe. Here is where somatosensory input is facilitated. Somato meaning body, and sensory, of course, means sensations. That's your temperature, touch, pain, movement, and stretch. The lateral sulcus, which would be here, is your lateral sulcus, divides the parietal and the frontal from the temporal lobe, which you see here in blue, and there's this little lobe hanging off right over here. The temporal lobe is the area related to language, learning, hearing, and visual memory, while visual processing is done back here in the occipital lobe, located posterior in the cerebrum. So that was generally a basic overview of the parts and functions of the various parts of the brain. Obviously we can go deeper, but to keep this in a quick little 5-minute video or so, you really got to touch just the surface of things. But in conclusion, I really want to talk about real quick the hemispheres. They look exactly the same, but they function differently, and it even functions differently when it comes to individuals. For myself, I am right-handed or right-hand dominant. The left side of my brain is for speech and language, whereas the right side of my brain would be for the emotional section of speech and language. And so if someone tells a joke, I perceive it on the left, but emotionally I will be able to differentiate from like humor, sarcasm, and things of that nature. I hope you learned something. Leave some comments down below, and I'll see you next time.